We are live. Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. This is Robert Bellissimo at the Movies, a video podcast. And my guest today is Glenn Frankel, who is the writer of this incredible book on Midnight Cowboy called Shooting Midnight Cowboy: Art, Sex, Loneliness, Liberation, and the Making of a Dark Classic. He also wrote books on The Searchers and High Noon, two classic films. And he was a reporter at the National Post for 27 years. And in 1989, he won the Pulitzer Prize for international reporting. So Glenn, thanks so much again for joining me today.
Well, Robert, thanks for having me. It'd be fun to talk to someone who's a filmmaker themselves. So let's see what you got.
Well, before we went live, as I was saying, this is one of my favorite books. Before I spoke to Nancy Bursky about it, I had heard it. It had been written into a book earlier this year, so I picked it up and jumped at it right away. But before we go into the nitty-gritty of the book, I wanted to ask, just in terms of the story, where, because this book is so much that from its time, as we saw in the book, the politics of the time led to the making of this film. Hollywood was changing so much. The ratings, the Hays Code, they threw away with, and so on and so forth. But where do you think the heart of the story lies?
Well, that's interesting. I mean, yes, there are two different ways to look at that. Certainly, what my books try to do, and this book especially, is to look at an iconic movie from an era and then show how that movie sort of opens a looking glass or a window onto the historical era itself. And in this case, Midnight Cowboy was filmed mostly in New York in 1968, and it premiered in 1969. And the movie reflects in many ways the politics and the culture and all of the anxieties and conflicts of that era. But at the same time, looking at the movie itself, and when you think about the beating heart of the movie, I think it has to remain what it began with and what first attracted, say, the director John Schlesinger to it, which is the story of these two social outcasts. The young Joe Buck, someone from Texas who's had a very isolated, lonely childhood and very difficult times in Texas, who gets on, who buys a cowboy outfit, gets on a bus and comes to New York essentially to try to find his future, to try to become somebody. And in his case, what he's thinking he's going to become is a male hustler on the streets of New York, servicing, I guess, upper middle class frustrated women for money. That's his dream. But of course, that dream is a long way from ever being realized in New York. He meets a bunch of various New York predators, con men, hustlers, you name it. And one of them is this guy, Ratso Rizzo, this sort of street bum, con man, disabled, with a lung condition, also walking the streets of Times Square in New York. And it's the very difficult, complex, sometimes belligerent partnership between these two lonely, vulnerable people, God's loneliest men, you might say. And the wary partnership that grows between them over time as they face a New York City winter without any money, without any future, and that friendship that's formed and that reliance that they have on each other and their own vulnerability and their sort of mutual dependency. I think that's the heart of the movie and the heart of the story. I think that's the reason why Midnight Cowboy, and there are many other reasons why it's a fun movie, why it's a great movie. But that partnership is really at the heart of the story that John Schlesinger was telling and that, I'm bouncing off of in the book.
I really agree with that, because I've seen the film many, many times. And one thing that you point out in the book, which I hadn't really thought of before, and when I watched it again last night, I was surprised that this went over my head. But, Waldo Salt, of course, adapted the screenplay. And he really was a believer in the medium of images and less on dialogue. And when you watch the film, I was like, yes, it is a very visual film with the flashbacks, with the nightmares, with the fantasies, all of these things are, you really could have played as a silent picture, and then but then at the same time, everything you described, the heart of the relationship, it very much plays in that in the depth and the love that these two men gain for each other. But did that style, did you always see this as a stylized film before doing research on this book?
Well, yes and no. I mean, you're right about Waldo. He comes of age in Hollywood in the 30s.
Yeah.
And he and Joe Mankiewicz, who actually was his mentor, the great director of All About Eve and other movies. And we don't think of Joe Mankiewicz as someone associated with the visual vocabulary of cinema.
That's true, yeah.
But that's exactly where he comes from. And these guys understand early on that movies are visual and that everything needs to serve the image. That the screenplay, the words don't matter that much. The screenplay has to be about images and about how to service them. And I think you see that, as you point out. I mean, there's a surrealistic aspect to Midnight Cowboy.
Yeah.
It's an interesting mix. I mean, on the one hand, John Schlesinger, the director, and Adam Hollander, the Polish-born cinematographer, they come out of the sort of Italian neorealism, era of the 40s and 50s, the way films were being made in Europe, and they're great believers in that. John also comes from a documentary film background. His first filmmaking jobs are with the BBC TV, right, doing very short, punchy black and white documentaries. And his first movies are what we call kitchen sink dramas, set in Northern England, but also very visual. So that's always part of what he's about. You combine him with Waldo, and you set the story inside the head of this lonely, vulnerable, sexually, let's say, confused pseudo-cowboy, faux cowboy, Joe Buck, who's only a cowboy because he's put on a cowboy outfit to go to New York, of all places. And you're seeing everything in this movie through Joe Buck's eyes and filtering it through his sensibilities. So that, too, invites a sort of surrealistic, sometimes non-chronological, very much stream of consciousness at times, which is brilliantly translated into images, both by Hollander and in the screenplay, because Waldo, again, he's an apostle of the image. He believes that screenwriting is an entirely new way of writing. It's as revolutionary as Shakespeare writing for the Globe Theater, or as poetry. It's more like poetry than prose, more like poetry than, say, playwriting even. So you've got these interesting people looking to tell a story by communicating images more than anything else. And one of the joys of looking back on it now as an ex-New Yorker myself is to see, who lived in New York. I went to college in New York in the late 60s and early 70s. And boy, I see that New York all through this movie. I see it depicted on the streets, in the parties, in the language, in this, it feels a little scary. It feels a little crazy. Feels a little, you never know what's going to happen next or what you're going to bump into on the street. Yeah, that's the New York I remember very well in that era, very well.
And they have so many beautiful moments in the film, like, beautiful that not that they're entertaining, but just that they captured a real reality of Joe Buck, the woman and her son with the toy mouse on the face, and seeing the guy on the street, and as you said in the book, these were things that they saw when they were doing research or in a cafe and thought, put it in the movie. Sure enough, they must have. These things happen all the time. It's interesting because Waldo Salt he went on to do some quite dialogue-heavy films. You look at Serpico or even Coming Home. Did anything in your research pop up as to why he would take on those more, dialogue-heavy stories after this?
Well, it's partly based, I think, on Waldo's own biography, if you will. A movie like Serpico, which is with Al Pacino, which is about a loner who stands up against the corruption of the New York Police Department, based on a true story. As they often say in Hollywood, but in this case, it really is based on a true story of Frank Serpico.
Yeah.
And that, I think, speaks to Waldo's sense of being an outsider in American society. He was a member of the American Communist Party. He's blacklisted in the early 1950s because of his beliefs. He refuses to renounce the party and to go along with the witch hunt of that era. So Serpico appealed to his sensibility and to his politics. Now, coming home, it's hard to say. Waldo wrote about 50, 60 pages of screenplay, and then he had a heart attack. And so he had worked in studying and in preparing to do the screenplay. Waldo was a great one for preparation. His claim was that the screenplay itself was the easy part, but the build up to it and deciding what is the story really about and what images and what things are we going to use to tell this story. And then at the last minute, I'll write a couple of pages to go along with it. He didn't always convince the people who'd hired him that this was the best process, incidentally, but that was his process. So he writes about 60 pages and then he's felled by a heart attack. And other people contribute to the screenplay, including Jane Fonda, who was the sort of, the guiding light behind Coming Home. It's an anti-Vietnam War movie. Jon Voight writes a little here. They're all involved in trying to get this thing. Hal Ashby, the director. So you can't see too much of Waldo, I guess is what I'm saying, too much of Waldo's sensibility in the final product there, because he was out of it at that point. He does share the Oscar for Best Screenplay, for Best Original Screenplay, but he shares it with two other people and there were a passel of others involved in it.
Oh yeah, well I imagine perhaps also just the subject matter is what would strike him more than thinking about dialogue and whether it would be visual or dialogue, heavy. I also found it interesting that he was one of the only screenwriters who liked the novel by James Herlihy, which I'm surprised that Gore Vidal and these people wouldn't have seen that it had a lot of potential, that it was quite progressive and obviously had gay themes in it, even though it's in this hustler and transactional way. But was talking to Dustin Hoffman and Jon Voight, was that I know that you said it took a while to get them, but was it easy to open them up about this experience?
Well, it did take a while to get to each of them. Voight was a little easier than Hoffman, but eventually I did get to both of them. And they actually are both quite generous and had, I would say, loving memories of the experience of working on the film. I mean, especially for Voight, for whom this is really his first movie. He's spent nearly 10 years in New York going to acting classes, going off Broadway. He was briefly in The Sound of Music on Broadway in a small role, but it was tough out there, and he was a real perfectionist and really dedicated to his craft, as was Hoffman. But Voight remembers this as such a great experience. I mean, he has to carry the movie. It's called Midnight Cowboy, and it's Joe Buck's story. And he's in every scene, either with Hoffman in a lot of them as Ratso Rizzo, the street outcast, or in smaller little playlets with the supporting cast, people like Sylvia Miles, for example, who was on the screen for all of 6 minutes and 17 seconds as an aging hooker, but she's so good. And
she was great.
Yeah, and such a New York-centric performance. She's tough, she's hard-bitten. It's got a lot of comedy in it. She got nominated for Best Supporting Actress for 6 minutes and 17 seconds of pure acting. And a number of others. So yes, they talked about it in very generous terms. They loved working with John Schlesinger. They loved the fellow actors. They knew how important this movie was in their careers, and they loved working with each other. They challenged each other. They supported each other. You can't talk about either of their performances without talking about the other one, because this is definitely a collaborative effort, and I learned a lot. I mean, my most fun with each of them was to talk about the other guy, and they have great fond memories of doing this movie.
You bring up a good point about the humor of the film, because I know you had mentioned that in the book and in other interviews that you've been doing lately, and I found myself laughing a lot watching it, particularly just watching Rizzo, steal like the fruit from the fruit stand, or the hat, how they trick the the hat owner that where the ticket is and it's in the corner. And there's a lot of really funny stuff, but then when it gets sad or serious, it gets really sad. It just worked on so many levels that I think it's just. I think you're right. I mean, I'm glad you wrote this book because I know it won Best Picture, but it certainly hasn't been doesn't get talked about as much in the new Hollywood era as much as I think it should. I mean, have you found that as well?
Yeah, I thought one of the reasons I was attracted to doing this particular movie, well, there were several reasons. One, having done High Noon and The Searchers, which are great iconic westerns of the 50s, I wanted to move a little forward and to maybe be able to tackle slightly more adult themes, and the late 60s, which is such a fascinating, fertile, and anxious era. But also I did feel, you look for a movie that hasn't been written about endlessly, and Midnight Cowboy did not have a book dedicated to it. I do think it's a little overlooked. It's funny to say because you see it on the American Film Institute's list of 100 best movies, ranks in the 30s, early 40s.
Yeah.
But when people talk about the great movies in the pantheon of New Hollywood, like Bonnie and Clyde and The Graduate and Last Picture Show, MASH, Midnight Cowboy gets a little shunted to the side. And among the great directors of that era, we hear about Francis Ford Coppola and Martin Scorsese, Altman, Hal Ashby, but not so much John Schlesinger. Partly, I guess, because he's a Brit. Perhaps because he was a gay man, that factored in, because his career was a little meteoric in some ways, but not more so than, say, Peter Bogdanovich or some of the other great
that's true.
of the era. But I think this movie ranks right up there with the best of them. And in part because of the reasons you just suggested, it covers so much ground emotionally between, there's humor, there's incredible darkness in it, there's a little bit of violence. John Schlesinger's reaching to get at the truth of what these guys are about, of who they are and what they're facing. And it's unblinking. I mean, he could have made Joe Buck into a hero, right? Into the naive, charming, vulnerable cowboy, who breaks our hearts and makes us feel good about ourselves. It could have been a tale of redemption. Well, it's not. It's not. It's something much tougher than that, yet at the same time, very compelling, in part because Voight is so good, but also in part because John Schlesinger, sticks to telling a story that's not on one level, that's complex. There are things about Joe we like a lot, and then there are things that repel us about him. He's wounded in so many ways, and Schlesinger never shies away, and the story never shies away from giving us the good and the bad.
I like that you use the word wounded because it reminds me so much of those flashbacks to, of course, the gang rape scene and with Crazy. Sorry, why am I forgetting the name? Not Crazy Ann, is it? No.
Crazy Annie.
Crazy Annie. Sorry, I was close. I've only seen it about 30 times. Crazy Annie I believe you touched on this, or perhaps you did go into it in the book, but were those flashbacks actually drawn out much more in the book than they are in the movie?
Yeah, it's a different narrative in the sense that the first half of the book really takes place in Texas and is the more or less chronological story of Joe Buck's childhood and early adulthood. And so things pop up along the way in natural order. And then, he begins with an introduction. It's rather similar to the movie in spirit, which is he's on, gets on a bus and goes to New York. But then Herlihy, the author, drops back to Joe Buck's life in Texas. Now, that would have made a 4-hour movie.
Yeah.
There were some things Schlesinger would have loved to have saved, including one of the gay characters from the first half, who has a sort of James Dean, bad boy aspect to him. John really wanted that guy in the movie, but there just wasn't any room for that character in the end. So instead, they eventually, even though they filmed a little bit of straightforward narrative, but in the end, they didn't use it that way. They chopped it up. They put it in what they called flash cuts, so that when Joe Buck is thinking about the past while something's happening to him in the present, we're seeing it. And it can be confusing, I think, in some ways for the first-time viewer because we don't know quite what's going on. But again, because it's from inside the head of Joe Buck, I think you gradually catch on to the fact that this is him reliving moments from Texas and explaining to us in a way, or we're learning how complex and difficult his life has been and why this naive, country mouse type guy ends up walking the streets of Times Square thinking he's going to have a male hustling career. what's the problem? What's he run into? It's a very modern film technique. It works sometimes very well and sometimes less well, but it does put us deeply inside this guy's, not only what he's thinking, but what he's feeling.
Yeah, I really thought that those flashbacks were essential and incredible, because it also really lets you know why he would pursue something like hustling. Because as I know, and people watching, the grandmother was a prostitute. Crazy Ann was like the neighbor. Everyone treated her as a purely sexual figure. The rape, the gang. He had been through horrendous. He was just constantly surrounded by transactional sex. That it made sense that was something I never quite hooked my head around. But I think it, as you said, perhaps in the first viewing, you don't quite get that. But I think that's why it's something to go back to discover more and more. I think I certainly go back to it, and as I said, I've seen it so many times, but I still had to make so many discoveries. I never even noticed that off the top, that wide shot with the little boy must be Joe Buck, totally alone. And I thought, and I think after already knowing the story, it hits you more on later viewings, because here's that lone boy. And I just thought that's just so heartbreaking. This kid all alone, no parents, grandmother who's, prostitute, and just he leads him to, take on the same work. But yeah, it's such a moving portrait. There's just some comments in the comment box, and if people have any questions, feel free to drop them in the comment box, and I'll ask Glenn for you. Michael here is saying, I read Mr. Frankel's book about a month ago and really enjoyed it. He says, I'd like to reread the novel, which I read in 1968. Yeah, I have to read the novel as well, because you're quite fond of the novel, right, Glenn?
Yeah, Jim Herlihy was a really interesting figure, to put it mildly. He's from Detroit. He grows up in Detroit. He's from a working class family there. He wants to be a writer from his earliest days. That's what he's aiming at, with a capital W. He wants to be an artist. And he serves a little time in the military, and he comes out, and with the GI Bill, he takes himself down to a place called Black Mountain College, this experimental arts college in North Carolina. That was an interesting, sort of very fertile place. He doesn't succeed there, but he meets some people who influence him very much later in life, including Anais Nin, the great erotic diarist, who sort of adopts him and becomes his mentor. Anyway, this is Jim's best novel, his most intimate, personal novel about being gay, about experiencing gay situation, coming to terms with your own sexuality, coming to New York, because that's something Jim did. He arrived on a Greyhound bus in the early 1950s. He had a lot more success than Joe Buck, but he was a lot smarter than Joe Buck. This story plays out all of his knowledge and his anxieties in an interesting way. And the novel was overlooked when it came out, sold a lot of copies in the Dell paperback that had, Dustin Hoffman and Jon Voight on the cover, and made Jim a rather wealthy man at that point. But I think it's sort of faded, even more than the movie. People don't read the novel anymore. I think it's one of the better novels that cover this kind of unusual, unconventional ground in the early mid-'60s, when novels are becoming more adventurous, when sexuality, our attitudes about sexuality are beginning to change. You couldn't do this kind of novel probably 10 years earlier. But there it is. And anyone who enjoys the movie will want to go back to it. There are scenes, some of the New York scenes are produced, and some of the dialogue even is produced directly from the novel. Waldo really liked the novel, Waldo Salt, and he pulled things from it, like that scene with the aging hooker, the Sylvia Miles character, like the scene with Brenda Vaccaro, some other things that are directly from the novel.
Yeah, I've got to read that book for sure, because I think you're right. If you like the movie and if you're fascinated by the characters, you're just going to get more and more from the book. So I certainly am gonna read the book next. I was really fascinated by this, the fact that the of course, I have a little card here. As we all know, I'm walking here. These actually come from the DVD. This is an older one from 2006 that came out that has really great featurettes and a booklet inside. But I was really fascinated by the fact that you found out that it is actually in the script that a car pulls up, and that the only thing that was improvised, that it was improvised, where he says, I'm walking here, and he slams his hands on the car. And as you said, Dustin Hoffman, for anyone who doesn't know, for years said that someone just drove that car through and no one knew it was going to happen, and he reacted as in character. Did you know that was in the script before talking to Dustin? And if so, did you tell him that this is only 50% true, the way you've been telling it all these years?
Well, yes, as the short answer. I'd seen these draft scripts. Waldo Salt's papers are at UCLA, and they had several draft scripts. And there's one from around December 1967, which is about 6 months before this scene was shot. And there it is. But there's no dialogue. I think, Robert, it's fair not to underestimate the importance of the lines.
No, definitely.
Script, yeah. Ratso doesn't say anything. He just slams his hand on and he flicks off the cab driver with his thumb. Dustin, maybe it was a totally improvised line, or maybe he knew that because he knew the cab driver was going to pull into the crosswalk, try to beat the light. So maybe he had some time to work out the line, but it's a great line and people love it.
Oh, yeah.
It sums up, again, a New York attitude, a sort of us against the world, and an attitude about this disabled man. Dustin told me that in terms of studying the play, Ratso Rizzo, he had wandered the streets of Times Square and specifically looking for disabled people who were streetwalkers, who were around, to see how they reacted. And he's a great student of acting, and he followed them around and he saw that spirit that they were often the first person across the street.
Yeah. I love that detail in the book.
Exactly. Me against the world. And the way he imitated the limp that Herlihy writes in the novel. So he was in the spirit of this, and it's his line, whether he came up for it right then in the crosswalk or he thought about it. And it's a memorable line. So let's give him 50% of the credit anyway.
Yeah, no, certainly. But I was curious, how did he react when you said that? Did you mention that to him, or were you like,
yeah,
you don't want to? Maybe...
I said I saw it in the script, and he pretty much went on from there. He didn't react.
Okay.
Dustin has told this story many times.
Many times, yeah.
And he's acted it out many times. And sure enough, when I was there, sitting across the conference table from him in his office, he stood up and he acted out the scene and he slammed the conference table like as if it were the hood of the taxi. Now, at some point, I'm not going to argue with Dustin Hoffman.
No, of course not.
Yeah. So he's got his story, and I've got my draft script.
Yeah, no, definitely. I mean, it was such a perfect moment. Actually, it was the very first thing I ever saw of it. Just some clip on TV as I was getting into movies as a teenager. I was like, what is this film? Just the energy of that scene, and I had to see it. But yeah, I mean, it was that he wanted to say we're filming here, right? And then it came out as I'm walking here.
His first reaction, he said, was to say, hey, we're making a movie here.
Yeah.
And then he caught himself and he stayed in character. And again, okay, but the line itself is the main. I'm walking here. And then there's he swears at the guy after that. I mean, that's the essence of New York street talk. And nobody's ever done it better than that.
Did you find out who played that cab driver? Like that, I imagine they had like, that was cast then, I imagine, if it was in the script.
Well, it was a crew member. I don't know that they cast it with a real actor because he's got no line, but they needed somebody who could drive the car with the right timing and all that. And it was some crew member. No, I don't know who, but there it was. And he was supposed to be in the crosswalk at that point, and he was. Yeah, you hear him muffle something, but it's not clear. The cab driver. Was there anyone who didn't want to talk to you about this, or was everyone totally open? I'm trying to think if anybody really didn't want to talk about the movie. No, I mean, some people's memories were a little foggy for various understandable reasons, but there's some incredibly talented people who worked on this film, not only the actors who we've talked about and John Schlesinger and the great supporting cast, but also people like Ann Roth, the costume designer. Who, you know, designs Joe Buck's cowboy outfit and the cowhide suitcase and Ratso Rizzo's outfits, and who incidentally just last month at age 89 won another Academy Award for costume design for Ma Rainey's Black Bottom. Yeah. I love talking to Ann Roth and her explaining to me how she came up with these ideas and being on set. Nobody said no to me. Some people were a little hard to find. Sylvia Miles was quite ill by the time I really got working on this, and I never got to talk to her, and she died recently. A number of folks have passed on since the time I did the film, but all of them, as far as I can recall, they were all happy to talk about it because it really was one of the creative highlights of their careers. And they all have pretty fond memories, and based in part, I mean, Adam Hollander, for example, the director of photography, he was essential to this movie, and he understands to this day what a special thing it was. The collaborative spirit of the movie, the way, say, you know, that Waldo Salt was on the set almost every day, and Ann Roth designed all the costumes, not just for the stars, but for everyone else, and was constantly being consulted. There was this little community of people who worked together on it, and they all love talking about it, and they were happy to see me.
No, that's good. That's good to hear. I'm glad that everyone had such a positive experience that spoke to you working on this film. Did you speak to David Picker as well? Was he someone you were able to, or had he already passed by then?
No, David Picker was still alive. I got him on the phone. I had read his memoir, which has a chapter on Midnight Cowboy and many other wonderful things in it. A really great book.
Yeah, I'll have to read his book. I didn't know he had a book.
Yes, he's got a book which includes a little bit about how, how they got United Artists came involved with the James Bond movies and A Hard Day's Night by the Beatles. And some of the, it's got some great stories in it. Picker was happy to talk to me. He was fading a little bit, but he was quite clear about the things I really wanted to know about. No, it was a pleasure to talk to him. He passed away about a year later. Jerry Hellman, the producer.
Yeah, just passed.
Yeah, just last week. Now, Jerry had a stroke about a dozen years earlier that really limited his speech and his ability to walk. I went up to visit him in the Berkshire Mountains where he lived with his wife, Elizabeth, and they were so nice to me. Jerry could only talk for about an hour at a time, and then he would have to rest and catch his breath. But, he answered all my questions. He was very warm and generous. He gave me a copy of the 70-page memoir that he had written but not published about making the movie. Loaned me his files. Liz, too. They were just enormously supportive. This was fun. It was fun to meet these people and to talk to them about this because they all contributed. Unfortunately, John Schlesinger had died in 2002, but John's former, longtime partner, a guy named Michael Childers, who was a young man, a UCLA film student who came and was involved as an assistant to John during the making of the movie. I mean, Michael was enormously helpful. So it was a pleasure to meet these folks.
Yeah, no, it sounds like it was a lot of fun for sure. Did David Picker, because there's this, which another thing I never knew, the whole X rating scenario story of, because, that it was, I always thought the same thing, that it was the censor board who gave it the X rating. But as you say in the book, it was UA, it was Picker. But, I've seen him in other interviews, and he doesn't necessarily make it seem like it was his decision. I mean, did that come up with him?
No, I didn't know the story then. And in any event, it's not Picker. It's Arthur Krim, the head of
oh, okay, I got that wrong.
The guy. Now Picker went along with it, but you're right. Both Picker and Jerry Hellman, for that matter, have always told a different story. The truth is, Robert, you talked about this earlier. The production code system had been scrapped in the late 60s because Hollywood was looking to get new, younger audiences in, and they realized that under the production code, where you couldn't show a husband and wife in bed together, let alone having sex, they weren't going to be able to make more modern adult movies that might attract, say, younger baby boomer audience. So they moved to the rating system. The ratings people rated this R according to a member of the board itself. But Krim, who was concerned about the gay sex scenes in the movie and that might influence people, he's the one who personally rated it X, but he didn't tell anybody that he'd done it. It sounded like the ratings board had done it. This was an important moment for me, not only because to get at the truth of this, but because, I'm trying to write a book that not only describes the making of the movie, but the historical era that the movie reflects. And in this case, attitudes about homosexuality and the notion still prevalent, even in liberal New York in the late 60s, that homosexuality was a disease. Worse than that, it was a contagious disease. You could spread it to young people, and that there was a cure for it, which is to say psychoanalysis, and therefore people who didn't go and get cured were especially sick and perverted. And, Arthur Krim and perhaps David Picker too, I don't know, shared this conventional wisdom at the time. And that's why the movie ends up being X-rated. It becomes the only X-rated film to win the Oscar for Best Picture. And after that, United Artists goes back to the ratings board and says, we'd really like to have that R now. And they give it to him without debate. But, in a funny way, the X rating, I think, was attributed to part of the popularity of the movie.
Yeah, because they used it, right, to promote it.
Yeah, they took advantage of it to say whatever you've heard about Midnight Cowboy is true.
It's true.
And that made it just a little more appealing and a little more risque for people like me. I mean, I'm 19 years old when it comes out, and I'm interested in seeing it because it's got Dustin Hoffman, the great new counterculture icon, and it's rated X. It's rated X. I know that helped drive me to the theater.
Yeah, no, I can see how they took full advantage of that. This also fascinated me. I know you said that you were really shocked to find out that even the Freudians would have, in liberal New York, would have said homosexuality was a disease. I mean, for the people whose livelihood was built on research and psychology, why would they have any idea why they just made something like that up? Where did this bias and prejudice come from?
Well, it came from a deep-seated fear of homosexuality and of any unconventional sexuality. I mean, we're emerging from a much different era.
Yeah.
The Freudian psychoanalysts were like a priesthood in New York in that era. Anybody with enough money, all of the upper middle class white folks, or a lot of them, were in analysis. It's like a bad Woody Allen movie, And I mean, there's purveyors of conventional wisdom as much as anyone else. And they had this whole theory about narcissism and gay people and, all of this based on no research. The only research they did was among the people who came as patients to them who had problems. They didn't talk to most gay people. They didn't do any kind of, blind study of I think they would have found out that, yes, I mean, many gay people have psychiatric issues like many straight people do. But so the research was basically non-existent. But the prejudices and the concerns about homosexuality and the misunderstandings were very clear. And it's only in 1973 that the American Psychiatric Association finally takes homosexuality off its list of psychiatric illnesses, and things begin to change in dramatic ways. But again, for my purposes of writing about this in the book, this is exactly the kind of thing I'm always looking for, something that mirrors the attitudes and the sensibility of the era it was made in. And in this case, because John Schlesinger is making a movie with gay characters and gay moments, and very difficult characters in many ways, to open the window on how that was treated and what he was up against, just for me made the book richer.
No, yeah, it absolutely did. And like I said, I was also very, very surprised. New York of all places. Something we touched on a little bit is this. I really love how, because when I started reading it, and I've read a lot of film books that I really enjoyed, and I was expecting, boom, the production started here, they cast, but this is, as you said, and as we've discussed, is really about how the era influenced the movie, and even things that how politics and things changed after the movie, like the Stonewall Rising and things like that. So this was something I know you had said when you started to write a book about the Searchers, that this subgenre sort of evolved from there. So once you wrote the book on the Searchers, did you then think, I'm going to keep doing this? I'm going to keep finding movies, or is it just one organic way that led to another?
Well, as I recall it, I stumbled into the backstory of the Searchers, if you will. The fact that Searchers, which is, this great John Ford movie about the kidnapping of a young girl by Comanches in Texas. And I stumbled across the fact early on that there was an original kidnapping of a 9-year-old girl in Texas by Comanches. That was a story that was, if I'd grown up in Texas, I would know the story because they teach it in middle schools, but I didn't know it. But I got to know it, and that made that particular book much broader and much more complex than I had originally intended. And then at that point I was teaching journalism at the University of Texas and sharing a building with the radio, TV, film department. And when my Searchers book came out, some of my friends from the department and I put together a program of Western movies. And not me, I did Searchers, but somebody else, somebody who really knows a lot about film studies, did High Noon. And he not only explained the glories of High Noon as a movie, but he also talked about the blacklist in High Noon and how the screenplay writer Carl Foreman was called to testify at the time the movie was being made. So that originally gave me, immediately gave me two potential tracks to follow for that movie: the movie itself and the blacklist and what was going on. And even more than in Searchers, those two were happening simultaneously in the late 40s and early 50s. It made it a little easier for me I had to answer the question, are you really a movie book writer? Doing the first one, okay, that's fine. You did that because you love the Searchers and all this history. But is that what we're doing now? And I asked myself, and the answer was pretty easy. Yeah, of course that's what we're doing. This was a good story. It had, Gary Cooper, and it had Carl Foreman, and it had the blacklist. I mean, this was right up my métier, not just as someone writing about a movie, but, I was a journalist, as you suggested at the beginning, for like 35 years for the Washington Post and some other places. I love writing about history. I know something about history. I know a lot more about history than I know about film. I don't know how to make a film. I have to talk to people who know about making film. People like you and people in LA, being able to marry a good film and a time in history, it worked again. And so, yes, I was looking for a third one, no question. And I kind of knew what my lane was at that point. And I was looking for, as I said, for a movie that hadn't been written about too frequently. You see chapters on Midnight Cowboy in a biography of John Schlesinger or in some books about the era and all that, but otherwise, not so much. There's no book specifically about Midnight Cowboy. That great little set of British Film Institute books that deal with individual movies. They've done about 120 of them. They're wonderful. There isn't one about Midnight Cowboy. So
true.
Once I found that out, and having my own memories of it and of New York in that era, I knew I was going to do it. And I'm awfully glad I did. In many ways, it was the most satisfying of the three to work on.
Do you start first with the era, or do you start first with which movie am I going to write about? Or is it hard to nail down?
Well, I'm definitely looking first for the movie. I sort of expect that any movie I decide, is rich enough will reflect the era. but I'm also looking to see who made the movie and when they made the movie. I mean, but the movie comes first in that sense. It's got to be a movie that I really, really like, that hasn't been done to death. I mean, I'm never going to do The Godfather. I'm never going to do Citizen Kane. I would love to. I love those movies.
Yeah.
I think they're very rich and resonant in so many ways. If I could do
Me too.
a book about Citizen Kane, I might, because I'm a journalist. But that's never going to happen. I'm looking for, so I'm not worried about I'm always going to find the history, because history is always reflected in these movies. It's a great looking glass or window into an era. I've got to find a movie that's rich, that hasn't been overdone, and that speaks to me personally. Fortunately, I love movies, and there are a lot of movies that speak to me personally, and a lot of great stories to be told. So I feel very fortunate to have stumbled into this little subgenre at this late stage in my long career as a writer and a journalist. Our culture is so complicated and so interesting, and Midnight Cowboy being set in the late 60s, a time of, great political anxiety with the Vietnam War and the murders of Martin Luther King and Robert Kennedy, and changes in New York, and then changes in our culture. I mean, the advent of more adult movies, not just movies, but novels like Portnoy's Complaint and John Updike's Couples, and stage and screen, and all kinds of things going on. It is an era of great, very rich, very scary, very gritty. All those things made it irresistible.
Well, I think it's wonderful, and anyone who's watching this, who knows the movie, the reading the book, then it just makes the movie so much more enjoyable, because now I know. I mean, I of course know about the 60s, but I mean, it goes into such great detail about the garbage strikes in New York and how much homophobia. I mean, that there was even in a place like New York in the late 1960s. I mean, you particularly see that with the with Rizzo and with Joe Buck, with the words they use when they describe gay people, and even the man who Joe Buck kills with the telephone. I actually never thought of that. When he's saying "I loathe life," I mean, he's obviously talking about having to hide. I mean, that's how having to hide who he really is. But it's not necessarily a film that goes so much into those themes. It's much more about the two men, but it certainly affects everything around it. So I think the history is so important to know, particularly with this film. Do you think it's really important for people to know, history in general? You were talking about history being something you love. Is that important with if you're someone looking at older films, or just in general, do you think?
Well, I think it enriches your experience of the film. I'm someone who, I'll see a movie and then I'll get interested in where the movie came from. Who made it? Why did they make it? Who's in it? Why is that person in it? What is that film really reflecting? And that immediately takes me into the question of history. I'm constantly watching things and then going back. It's a little bit like when I used to be a foreign correspondent for the Washington Post. The first time I would go to a new place, I would try to read a little bit before I went, but I really wasn't that engaged in the place until I got there and saw it. And once I'd been to a place like, I don't know, Mozambique or Zimbabwe, and got a feel for what the place itself was like, I was very hungry then to go back and study it and understand how things got that way. It's kind of an ass backwards process for me, I guess. By the same token, I mean, first I see the movie and then I decide, whether there's something there. There's always something there. There's always, whether they do it inadvertently or not, a good movie always reflects the era that it's about and the era that it was made in. Sometimes in, subconscious ways, but always. And again, you watch Midnight Cowboy and you're in New York in 1968. You're that skilled at taking you there. And I remember it very, very well. I remember walking the streets I wasn't looking to be a male hustler. I was actually looking to go to double features for $1 down in Times Square. I remember seeing the Wild Bunch there. The first, when Woodstock came out, the documentary, you could see these things there for much cheaper prices than going up to the Upper East Side. So, you know, to me, it resonated both personally and my own experiences, even though I'm not in the book, but my own personal experiences and my understanding of what New York was is reflected in almost every page of the book. And I just feel very lucky to be able to bring these two together because they really do enlighten each other. You learn a lot about the movie from the era, and you learn a lot about the era from the movie. And that's what I'm trying to do.
Yeah, well, you certainly did it very, very well. Gary Norris in the comment box is saying he read it and read it and see or revisit the film. If we had more books like this, more people would watch films would read. I like that. A great film starts with a story someone wrote down, and he says, "Thank you, Glenn." I like that comment.
I do too, Robert.
Yeah. You touched on an interview about journalism helping you so much with interviewing people. How so, do you think?
Well, you know, as I say, I've been a journalist for it's more than 40 years, and I've interviewed a lot of people. Not that many movie stars, I should add, a few, but a few world leaders and this and that, and right down from that to people on the street. And you know, you learn a few techniques like keeping your mouth shut a bit and doing the opposite of what we're doing right now, which is to say, I don't do much talking in interviews, or I try not to. I try to let the subject talk their way through. I find that silence sometimes is very useful, because people like to fill silence. I think it's important to interview people in their homes or in their own settings. There are things I've learned over the years, but also, I mean, as a journalist, you develop a sense of what you're looking for. And I'm always looking for the human quotient of things. So if I go into an archive, I'm looking for characters. I'm looking for people telling me how they felt when they did whatever it is I'm trying to write about. What happened to them, what really affected them. It's not enough just to open up an archive and expect it to tell you things. You have to have a sense of what you're looking for. And for me, it's always, again, that human core of something, to get under the skin of a person and see what was really motivating them, what they were really worried about, what they were really reacting to. You're trying to, when you can get under the skin of people in an era, then you begin to get under the skin, if you will, of the history of that era. So for me, it's very personal, not only in terms of doing the research, but also in terms of the writing. I try to write about characters. You know, and in this book, I was very fortunate to have so many really fascinating people. I wanted to know where the movie started, and not just with John Schlesinger, but who is James Leo Herlihy? Why don't we know about him anymore? What happened to him? What was bothering him? Why did he write this book? Who did he know? What influenced him? That's where I really wanted to begin. And that's a very journalistic instinct, I think.
Well, those are some great lessons for me there. I'll have to write those down. You touched on, you know, talking about how people were feeling when you were interviewing people in the past about what they did. Was there, you know, you said you're not in this book, of course, but is there something more personal about it that you connect to? I mean, you talked about being there in the 60s and seeing those streets and places, but is there something else that reminds you of yourself, that things that you've been through?
Well, that's a really good question. I think just my memories of being on the streets in New York with, you know, just a couple of bucks in my wallet, and being mostly on my own those first couple of years at Columbia University. Didn't have a lot of friends. As I say, didn't have a lot of money, didn't know a lot of people. Roaming the streets of New York, being what they call in France a flaneur, a walker, street walker, not in the sense of being a sex worker, but just somebody. And New York was such an interesting, crazy, complicated place. It was scary. The crime rate was going up. The unemployment rate was high. There was a garbage strike in '68. I mean, I was around for that. Watching Columbia University blow up in April '68 from demonstrators, you know, and the cops come on and, you know, and arrest hundreds of people. it was a tough place, and yet it also was just a fascinating place to be. So many interesting people struggling to find themselves. I felt all that personally, and the people I wrote about felt the same thing. Dustin Hoffman talked to me about, getting out of the bus, the carry bus, which took him from LaGuardia into town, and in 1959, I think, when he first came to New York from LA and wanted to be an actor, and how getting out of the bus and watching people on the street, and what a scary, lonely feeling that was. I could relate to that very, very well. Scary, lonely, challenging, difficult, but fascinating. And the promise of New York, the way it smelled, the way it looked, the way people treated you. Yeah, that's all. Midnight Cowboy, awakens that in me. And it gave me a way of writing about what I thought was important, and filtering it. So, for example, in the book, I described the police of that era as being just one more tribe in Manhattan. It used to be these various groups had something in common, their mutual love of the city. But by the late 60s, they were at war with each other, and the cops were not so much about, protecting the innocent or the weak. They were about keeping their own foothold and, and asserting their own power and authority. And that's based on my own experiences with police, especially at Columbia in that era. That felt true then. I'm not saying it's true now. I don't know. But I knew it then, and that informed how I wrote about them in the book.
Well, yeah, I mean, that's certainly a great. I really appreciate that you opened up your personal experience with the time, because now I can see you in the book now, even more so, from being there. Were you always, you talked about your affection for film and your love of different movies, but are you a big film buff in general? Do you love, films from all over the world, or are you just into a certain period?
I'm sort of a conventional film goer in the sense that I love Hollywood movies. Movies back in that era were a bigger part of our cultural lives. No question, from childhood on. I mean, my parents were New Yorkers. We moved up to Rochester, New York, as I mentioned to you before we began the interview. But we went to the movies every week in Rochester. I mean, they took me to see all kinds of stuff. I saw Searchers with them the first time when I was pretty young. So movies were part of my life. And when I get to New York City, where there are endless little repertory houses in those days, the Thalia and the Symphony and the New Yorker and the movie theaters downtown. And then even on 42nd Street, a number of places where you could see double features or foreign films. I sort of slipped right into that. At Columbia, they showed many movies. I often, Chuck, make the joke that I spent more time in the movies than I did in the classroom. It's almost true. And then I took Andrew Sarris's course. He began to teach an introductory film course in around 1969. And I was I took the first year of that. So I was getting both a sort of general education. If you hung around the Thalia and went to the double features, you could get a film history course that included French, Italian, British, Sachet Ray, all kinds of movies, the new Polanski, all kinds of things going on every year in repertory terms. I spent a lot of time on those crooked floors at the Thalia. Part of it looked like you were looking up at a movie. I mean, it's like the floor was warped in a way that it was, this little place, but you could see everything there over the course of a year or two. And so I took full advantage of that. We talked about movies. We wanted to write movies. I don't pretend to be a film studies expert. I took a course in John Wayne when I got to Stanford, when I was teaching journalism there. So I've got a little bit of academic education, but not much. It's mostly was just a very personal thing, as it was for millions and millions, especially of young people in that era.
How did you like Andrew Sarris? Oh,
I loved Andrew Sarris. I mean, was I an acolyte of the auteur theory versus some other theory? Not necessarily, but Andrew Sarris was a brilliant guy, and he was very down to earth. I mean, he was clearly highly educated. He was a Columbia grad from many years earlier, but he just talked in common sense, and he taught us about mise en scène and about cutting and point of view and different things that were really that montage, and introduced us to the great French directors like Jean Renoir and Jean Vigo. He just gave us a sort of thumbnail education, but from a very down-to-earth perspective, because he also introduced us to John Ford, and he treated John Ford movies and Alfred Hitchcock movies and Howard Hawks movies as art, not just as popular culture, but as actual real art. And he made us look at the movies. Again, we get back to what we were talking about much earlier, movies as images, as moving images, and what you could learn from that and how important that was, and who he thought were the great film artists. So it couldn't have been better. I loved that. I loved reading Pauline Kael. I loved, reading everything I could get my hands on. And then I worked for about 6 months as a clerk typist in the film department of the Museum of Modern Art after I graduated. And I helped rent out films. Nobody does this now. To high schools and colleges, you'd send them reels of films. Birth of a Nation, we'll send you the 8 reels. It'll take 2 weeks to get there. You'll show it, then you'll send it back to us. We'll charge you an extra $40. That sort of thing. And I saw a lot of movies at MoMA and all over town in the early 70s as a result of that. So yeah, I got a pretty good film education, but very little of it, institutional.
Can we go back in time and trade places, baby? Because I want to be you at that time. It must have been. Wow.
Yeah, it was the time McCabe and Mrs. Miller came out, and MoMA showed a premiere of that. They showed another movie with Julie Christie, The Go-Between. John Lennon and Yoko Ono came to the MoMA one day and showed The Fly.
Oh yeah, The Fly. Yeah.
Fly, and we got to meet John. He wasn't that.
Oh wow.
It was a very rich time. I also got to fondle Orson Welles' screenplay Oscar for Citizen Kane. He'd left it somewhere, and it was sitting on a desk for about 25 years at MoMA before his daughter finally claimed it back.
Oh wow, I did not know that. So that was sat at MoMA. Wow, I didn't know that.
Not on display. It was sitting in the office of my boss in the film rental department.
Oh wow. Well, not many people could say. I don't even think Peter Bogdanovich could say he touched that. Well, maybe.
I wouldn't be surprised if he did.
Something that I really love about the book is that every character seemed to be having a struggle before doing this. The Hellman, was his marriage was breaking up. Schlesinger was coming off, a couple of flops. Jon Voight was a struggling actor. Everyone seemed to be Herlihy had the film he adapted by the one John Frankenheimer directed didn't do so well. So everyone more or less. I loved how you really built that up until they all kind of came together. Did you go into all of their lives to give people more of an emotional connection to the people in the book?
Well, as I suggested earlier, I've got to write about, I've got to find people to write about, because that's all I know how to do. I write chronologically, I write narrative, I try to give you people who you can identify with, and I don't try to make them into heroes. I want to write about their weaknesses and their strengths and what's bothering them. And, like John Schlesinger was a very up and down guy. He was probably the most miserable person on the set of Midnight Cowboy in terms of being insecure, but at the same time, so I wanted to capture that, but also his brilliance. So yeah, I'm looking constantly to make these people real. It was pretty easy to do with Midnight Cowboy because there's such an interesting crew. A guy like Waldo Salt, who's blacklisted in the 50s, and then a mess. He's a lifetime alcoholic, and and he hits bottom. Those are the stories I want to tell. I didn't want to make him into some, as I say, great angelic hero. But Midnight Cowboy was really benefited in a way from his struggles and his understanding of how people struggled and his understanding of their vulnerability and his own. So this made it, I didn't have to make any of this up or invent backstories for these people. Their real stories were complicated. Sometimes they were self-destructive. Sometimes they were really treated their families badly, and they made big mistakes. But in the case of Midnight Cowboy, you know, for the most part, they came together in a very original kind of way. It's just it's human life, Robert, and that's what I'm trying to write about in the end. We're all, you know, that's what we're all trying to do. And we're interested in everybody else's life because we have to live our own. We have to figure out a way to live in the world. And that's what all these people were working on at the time. And that's what the story's about.
Yeah, well, I love that so much. I mean, I was finding sometimes when going into their lives that I wanted to know so much, you know, more about everybody, because as you said, everyone, it was such, they're also fascinating and all had such lives that were really, you know, tough with struggles, and you know, you can make a movie on Waldo Salt alone, I mean, or a book on Waldo Salt. You know, we haven't. I can't believe I haven't mentioned Marion Doherty yet, because of course the great casting director, who's of course, you know, really is responsible for he's particularly getting Jon Voight in this film. I was curious if you ever saw that documentary that came out on her about, I think, 8 years back.
It's called Casting By.
Yeah, it's a fascinating documentary. Yeah,
it is. And Marion also wrote with a co-writer, wrote a memoir of her own life.
I didn't know that. Yeah, I know you mentioned that.
Was too small, or was too, yeah. Anyway, yeah, Marion was a fascinating character. Unfortunately, she had passed away, and I think in 2012, so I never got to see her. But I got to watch that documentary. I got to talk to people about her, like Jon Voight, who really loved, you know, she helped Jon enormously.
Yeah.
I got to see her index of 3x5 cards, which are on file at the Motion Picture Academy Library in Beverly Hills, in pencil, all these cards, and, you know, one for Dustin Hoffman and one for Jon Voight. And she writes on the front and then on the back, Robert Duvall, all these people who she studied, and she had a card on everybody. What I loved about Marion was partly, you know, she was a New York-based person, and they needed a New York person to help cast this movie. In the old days, you know, the movie would have been made by some big studio out in Hollywood, and they wouldn't have even shot in New York.
Right.
They wouldn't have made it at all, probably, but if they had, and they would have just hired anybody that was on contract to the studios. But of course, by 67, 68, the studios were cutting back on all this personnel and all this, you know, infrastructure that they had. And so when John Schlesinger wants to make a New York movie, he needs somebody who knows New York actors. And Jerry Hellman, his producer, also a New Yorker, knows Marion Doherty. And she's essential to the quality of the movie because she helps find Voight and Hoffman and the supporting crew actors, and she stands up for them and helps convince Schlesinger that they're the right people for the movie.
Yeah, no, I remember being quite floored by that documentary, and yeah, Jon Voight talking about how he blew his, he really had to pursue it, right? I mean, he had blown his on the Naked City. I'm sure you saw his episode. It was quite bad. I mean, he was.
I saw it. It's a disaster.
Yeah.
Jon was quite candid about that, you know, and always has been.
Yeah.
But she saw something in him. She saw that he could play vulnerability, but also that he had a little bit of potential for violence in the core of his character. And she really pressed hard for him, and she was very frustrated when Schlesinger didn't want him. But eventually, the guy that Schlesinger chose, Michael Sarrazin, a very fine actor, his studio wanted too much money for him, and so they started looking at the audition tapes again, and eventually they cast Voight. And Schlesinger always admitted that it wasn't his idea, it was Marion's idea to cast Voight, and he was enormously grateful for that because Voight is so good. I mean, Voight is the heart of the movie.
Oh, yeah. Oh, no, absolutely. I was quite surprised that they actually had given it to Sarrazin, and then there was the contract dispute. I thought that they just looked at the screen tests and then thought, oh, yes, he's definitely better. But no, but he actually was cast, and thank God that. I mean, I think he was quite a good actor, but I mean, Jon Voight was born to play that part. I mean,
He certainly thought so. Jon Voight did. He was desperate for that part, and he told me, "Well, I was worried if they didn't cast me, the movie wouldn't be any good." People like Jon Voight and Dustin Hoffman are so. I mean, they're full of anxieties, I'm sure, about their work, and they're driven, but at the same time, they have to have a certain confidence.
Yeah.
And Voight has that. It was so interesting to talk to him, to see this combination of a certain level of humility and generosity, but at the same time, just being sure that he was the right person and knowing this was a part he could do. It was really, it's a great confidence that you have to have, and he had it.
Were you nervous to talk to him because perhaps like the politics would come up or the press would come up? I'm sure people know what I'm alluding to.
Well, Jon Voight, yes, has changed politics over the years from being pretty much to the left to now being, I think it's fair to say, Donald Trump's biggest supporter in Hollywood. But no, I wasn't nervous. That's one thing. If you've done this for as long as I have, that's not the problem. But I was wondering, whether he'd be willing to really engage with me. I mean, I worked for the Washington Post, which is probably not the favorite newspaper of anyone who likes Donald Trump. And the first couple of questions were a little, or his replies and his questions to me were a little pointed. But then he kind of looked at me and said, "But you're here to talk about Midnight Cowboy, right?" And I said, "Yep." And then, he kind of loosened up. His posture changed a bit. And that's what we talked about for the next 2.5 hours. And he was generous and he was warm. And he answered every question. Nothing stopped him. I mean, I made clear I was interested in that era and in his life up to then, and in the impact of Midnight Cowboy on his own career, all of that. And he was great. I think my portrait of Voight will surprise some people because it's a little friendlier. He's a little nicer guy than you might expect if you've only been watching him on YouTube lately. And he's a fabulous actor, I should add.
Yeah.
I mean, everything he's in, he's not, the movies sometimes aren't all that great, but Jon Voight always seems to nail it. He is an actor's actor.
Yeah, he's an excellent actor. Of course, winning the Oscar for Coming Home was well deserved. But I've met some people over the years who have met him, and they say the same thing. He's the nicest, warmest, most generous. I met a doorman once, who worked at a hotel, who was an actor, and asked him about acting advice, and took the time to talk to him. Whereas some movie stars wouldn't give you the time of day, is particularly if a certain jobs you have, or they just don't want to bother. But on the one hand, he's such a wonderful guy from what I've heard, but on the other hand, as you said, on the surface, when you hear him and some of his opinions, you think, my God, he must be awful, right?
Well, that's opinions. I guess some people share them, but yeah, I think Jon Voight's, I didn't ask him about that.
No, of course not. Yeah.
But I think Jon Voight is someone, whatever he does it 150%. There's no halfway measure with him. If he's for you, okay, he's totally for you. That's just how he's built. But that doesn't mean he isn't a nice guy.
No, of course, yeah.
When Jerry Hellman died a week ago, I got in touch with Voight, and he was, again, very warm and generous. He had really liked Jerry. They had worked together, on this movie, and they worked together again on Coming Home. Jerry was the producer of that movie, and so I knew Voight would be good to talk to, and he was. And again, you get that warmth and that feeling that this is somebody he cared about, and that he would, he enjoyed working with, and I knew that's what I would get, and that's what he gave me.
No, that's good to hear. Do you like any of the other films by Schlesinger? I always get that name wrong. Schlesinger. Yeah.
Yes.
What do you think of his other films?
Well, there are a couple I like a lot. The one he made directly after this, Sunday Bloody Sunday.
That's a great film.
Yeah, it comes out. In fact, it's 50 years old this year. It's set in London. It's about a Jewish doctor who's gay and who's having an affair with a young man, a young artist who is bisexual, and at the same time also carrying on an affair with a professional woman played by Glenda Jackson, so it's Peter Finch, Glenda Jackson, and a newcomer named Murray Head, and it's a fabulous movie. It's sort of London, New York, Midnight Cowboy's New York. Sunday Bloody Sunday is London. They're two very different movies.
Yeah.
But it's very intimate. It's very real. It's got wonderful acting and a great script. And I think that's one of the great, even more unsung than Midnight Cowboy in some ways. I love Darling with Julie Christie.
Darling's great.
A movie about swinging London and this kind of ruthless, predatory model who makes her way through there, sleeping her way through London, if you will. And it's brilliant. It's funny. It's got bite to it. I think that's the movie that announced John Schlesinger was somebody formidable and helped bring him to the States. So, the studios suddenly were very interested in him. Julie Christie wins the Oscar for Best Actress in her first starring role in that movie. Those three are my special, I think, John Schlesinger movies, but he makes some other great movies over time. Falcon and the Snowman, Madame Suzaka with Shirley MacLaine, Cold Comfort Farm. There are a number of really good films. And then Marathon Man, his other movie with Dustin Hoffman, which is it's kind of a horror story, New York movie about a Nazi and man, people die in that movie in all kinds of surprising ways. And it's got that great, that horrible moment when Laurence Olivier playing the Nazi sticks his scalpel in Dustin Hoffman's mouth.
The dental scene, yeah.
The worst dental scene in the history of movies. That's a very entertaining, scary movie. So I think Schlesinger, he doesn't get the credit he deserves. I
agree. Yeah, he doesn't.
Yeah, I don't know. Maybe in part because he was gay or because he's an outsider, he's a Brit. Because he's trying to be successful at the same time he's trying to be true to his vision of what a story should be. And but I love those are movies I love, and I think those movies will be around a long time.
Yeah, those are all fantastic. I also really love A Kind of Loving, which is one of his early films. That might have been his first feature, actually.
It is his first feature, and it is really good. I mean, people mistook him early on for a British kitchen sink drama movie maker, of social affairs, because that movie is set in North England and it's about people we seldom, see in movies. And it's really, really good. It's a quiet movie. It's beautifully acted. It's one of Alan Bates's first movie. And then Billy Liar, which is another Northern England movie, but much more of a comedy with Tom Courtenay and Julie Christie. John just had a style and an ability, whether he's making a comedy or a drama, to sort of meld those two together. We talked earlier about the amount of comedy that's in Midnight Cowboy. The more you watch that movie, the more you see the comedy. You're expecting the bleak stuff, but what's surprising is the other stuff that you begin to see in it that is so powerful. So, I mean, he was a very deft storyteller and works beautifully with actors all the way through. So those are great movies. Anybody, I think, again, John's a bit overlooked, but you go to Criterion and see some of the selection that they've got of his stuff, and it's all really good.
Yeah, that's where I mean, of course, I had seen Marathon Man, Falcon, and the Snowman, and Midnight Cowboy, but it wasn't until the Criterion channel started a couple of years ago that, A Kind of Loving and Sunday Bloody Sunday, and I thought the same thing. My God, this guy was not a one-hit wonder. I mean, he was a wonderful filmmaker. I just had one last question, and if anyone in the comment box, feel free to drop any questions you may have. Was that Jon Voight said something interesting? Was it's particularly when everyone was doubting whether this film would do well, particularly Schlesinger over and over again was really anxious about it, and Jon Voight, as you said in the book, said, "No, we're going to be." We're not going to be able to top this. So something along those lines. And do you think either Dustin or Jon Voight or Schlesinger or Hellman ever did anything that, in your opinion, was as special or as effective as this film?
Boy, that's a good question. I mean, both Hoffman and Voight, are in some very special films along the way. Coming Home is a special film. Is it as good as Midnight Cowboy? I don't think so, but you could make that case. And of course, Hoffman was in a number of great films over the years. Those other films we mentioned with Schlesinger, Sunday Bloody Sunday especially, is right up there at the top with Midnight Cowboy. It's hard to choose between them. I love Midnight Cowboy because it's New York. I know London reasonably well, having lived there for 6 years. But there's just something about Midnight Cowboy that, that really speaks to me. These are people working at the height of their powers. For Hellman, again, he's a driving force behind Coming Home. It doesn't get made unless he gets involved in it. And the acting is so good in that movie. Jon Voight is a lead player. He won the Academy Award for Best Actor and Jane Fonda for Best Actress. They are terrific. The movie's flawed in some ways, but the acting and the authenticity that they bring to it, Voight's as good in that as he is in Midnight Cowboy.
Yeah, it's a great, really good movie.
That's saying a lot. He's as good in that movie as he is in Midnight Cowboy.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah. Yeah, that's a fantastic film. I reviewed it on the channel, this channel once. I want to do, particularly because it's Pride Month, I really want to do Sunday Bloody Sunday to review that, because I think I agree with you. Phenomenal film. There's just a question in the chat box from Gary Norris. Has Glenn thought of writing a book on Waldo Salt?
Well, I thought about it, of course, because he's such an interesting character. But, I wrote a little bit about him in the High Noon book, and then a lot more about him in Midnight Cowboy. So I think I'm finished with Waldo. I had the pleasure. Waldo passed away more than 30 years ago, but his daughter, Jennifer, who was in Midnight Cowboy, her first movie as an actress, then went on to make a number of other movies and has become a screenwriter over the years. And I got to see Jennifer a couple of times, and she was wonderful to talk to, not only about her own career, but about her father and about Voight, who was her boyfriend at the time of Midnight Cowboy, as well as acting together. No, at this point, I think Waldo and I probably can call it a day. But he is such an interesting guy and so talented. And it really was redemptive for him to get involved in Midnight Cowboy, because it rescues his career. And he's not only writing the screenplay, but he's working with Voight and Hoffman, and he's on the set almost every day, and he loved it. He talked about what a pleasure it was to work with such great actors and to have his own opinions honored and treated, not just as a script doctor, but as a collaborator. So this was a redemptive moment for him, and really a beautiful moment. And then he goes on, of course, to write a couple of other great screenplays. But no, Gary, I think we're going to wrap it up with Waldo. At least for now.
He says, fair enough, you did him good.
Thanks.
I agree. How is your book on, have you started that book on Brian Epstein yet?
Well, I had done some research on Brian way back in 2005. He was the manager of the Beatles and the guy who gets the Beatles out of Liverpool and brings them to the world and helps shape their act and who they are. And I've always wanted to write about him, and I did research then, and I'm starting to do a little more research now. I was very fortunate to get a grant from the Biography Center at City University of New York, so that's what I'm going to be working on for the next year or two. So I've done a little research, got a lot of other things going on this summer, got some grandchildren to look after, and some people to see who I haven't seen in a year and a half, but yeah, I'm starting on Epstein.
I'm looking forward to that as a big Beatles fan. And I must admit, I've seen High Noon, but I haven't seen The Searchers. So I've got to see The Searchers now and read your book.
Robert.
Yeah, I know. Everyone has a few classics that they haven't seen, even people who love movies. But I certainly have to see that. And then, I'll have to read your other books as well. Well, Glenn, thank you so much for your time and for sharing your experiences and being so open on this fantastic book, Shooting Midnight Cowboy. Where's the best place to get it? It's on Amazon, direct from the publisher. Is there? What do you think?
Well, you can go on the Macmillan site. It's published by Farrar, Straus and Giroux, and you can simply Google Shooting Midnight Cowboy. And Macmillan, and you can buy it from them. You can go on my website, which is www.glennfrankel Glenn with two N's, Frankel, one word.com, and there are about 9 buttons on the homepage. Yeah. So you can buy it from a local independent. I would urge you to buy it from a local independent bookstore if you can. But if that's hard to do, you can order it online, sure, from Amazon or from a lot of these local shops. It's important that we keep independent bookstores alive.
Yeah, absolutely.
During this pandemic and beyond. So mine is Politics and Prose here in Washington, D.C., but there are many, many other great ones. And I'm just grateful for people who buy the book and who find the story as halfway near as, as exciting as I did to do.
Well, I'll leave the link to your website in the description box. And now we know, as you've announced, and Nancy Bursky, who I've interviewed before, is turning the book into a documentary, which I'm really looking forward to. Are you going to be involved in the documentary as well?
Yeah, I mean, I'll help Nancy in any way I can, and I certainly will collaborate with her and contribute whatever I can from the book, but that's up to her. I mean, she's out seeking funding. She knows what she's doing. She's made some really terrific documentaries.
Yeah, she's fantastic.
Yeah, so, but I'll do anything Nancy needs me to do, Robert. I think I'm just very pleased that someone with her talent and insight is going to take this on. Yeah,
no, me too. I was really happy to see, particularly after her By Sidney Lumet documentary, which I really loved. I think this book is certainly in good hands with the documentary. Well, Glenn, thanks again so much. And for those of you who left comments and questions in the chat box, thank you. If you haven't already done so, please consider subscribing to my video podcast here by pressing the subscribe button right beside the description box below. And then if you hit the bell, you'll get a notification every time I release a new video or go live. And I'm also now on an entertainment app called MoPfi TV, and the links for where you can get that app are in the description box below as well. Well, Glenn, thanks again. I really appreciate your time, and I hope once I read your other books, if you have time, I'll ask you back to talk Searchers and High Noon.
Sounds good, Robert. Thanks for your time. It's nice to meet you.
You too.